Okay, so we won't spend ages on these, but just to kind of give a little overview, and of course this list isn't exhaustive. There are more diagnosable eating disorders than this, but these are some of the more common ones. So anorexia, characterised by restriction of the diet, can also be characterised by a significant loss of weight and loss of menses in women if it reaches a clinical level. And what we might notice there is perhaps someone being quite secretive around food, restricting diet, skipping meals, saying that they've already eaten, but also perhaps wearing layers of clothing to cover up the body, but also possibly to keep the body warm. Bulimia, characterised by cycles of binging and purging, although I think that's not always a perfect accuracy of the expression of it, because it can be that people are eating kind of normal quantities of food, whatever that is, and actually purging that away as well. And that purging might take the form of vomiting, excessive exercise, the use of laxatives and such. Do come in, there's a few chairs, there's one chair over here. And then binge eating disorder, this more recently came into this diagnostic and statistical manual, characterised by eating more food than the body's able to comfortably assimilate, and that may and often does result in weight gain. Orthorexia, characterised by this kind of clean eating, so restricting the diet in a particular way, perhaps only eating raw foods or green foods, and being very rigid about that, and perhaps also being rigid about the timings of that eating. And we'll talk a lot about how that can sometimes conflate and overlap with an experience of BDD. And then it used to be eating disorders not otherwise specified, and they recognise, thankfully, that isn't the best term. So now it's this idea of other specified feeding or eating disorder, and what that means is that the person doesn't necessarily meet the clinical levels of diagnosis for these, but is still experiencing disordered eating. So for example, one of those is subclinical anorexia. So it might be that the person is significantly restricting their diet, but they don't meet the other criteria. For example, if they're a female, maybe they haven't lost menstruation, so then they may therefore come under this category. And of course, the scientific validity of psychiatric diagnosis is something that we could spend a long time talking about. And I think believing that human experience can fit into these neat little boxes is probably not quite accurate, actually. And all of these things often overlap and conflate, and we'll be speaking about that. And all of these, unfortunately, come with physical health dangers. So some of them, it can affect all the systems of the body, and I think that's important to hold in mind. But some of the perhaps more common, but also the more worrying, are around cardiovascular health, so the health of the heart. So, for example, particularly with anorexia, brachycardia, so a slow heart rate. Also, mitral valve prolapse is quite common in anorexia and bulimia, and this it's essentially a collapse of a valve in the heart that makes it very difficult for the heart to adequately pump blood around the body. Electrolyte imbalances, so these are kind of electrical signals to the heart, the balance between our calcium and potassium and such. I'm sorry that you have the floor, I apologise for that. Can have a big impact, a negative health impact, and actually unaddressed can be quite concerning in terms of organ damage. And then digestive issues, so people with eating disorders that struggle with disordered eating often do struggle with digestive issues, and not only when they're engaging in their period of disordered eating, but afterwards as well. And I highlight this because it can be a real barrier to treatment for people, because they're trying perhaps to increase their nutritional intake in the example of anorexia, but actually it's causing some physical pain, and therefore it can be inhibitory in terms of the desire to keep going and keep increasing the diet. And then the bone health as well, so low bone density. And I highlight these things for all sorts of reasons, but part of the reason is that if we're noticing that we ourselves are engaging in disordered eating behaviours, and or we notice it in a loved one or a friend, we really want to be supporting both them and anyone else medically supporting them to think about these aspects. Weight is not a good measure. So we have this kind of idea when we think about eating disorders often. as a kind of really emaciated, underweight young lady. Actually, it exists across all genders, and it exists across all weights as well. And people, very sadly, can and do experience cardiovascular difficulties, digestive difficulties, bone density difficulties, kidney, liver struggles at so-called healthy weights as defined by body mass index indicators. So going to the doctor, telling them that you're struggling with disordered eating, them saying, well, step on the weighing scale, and you step on and they check their little chart and they say, oh, you're within the BMI, the safe BMI, and sending you off on your way is not adequate, because we don't know what's going on with the heart, we don't know what's going on in other systems of the body. So we want to be supporting GPs to think about how do we, checking out electrolytes, checking out the balance of the electrolytes, checking out the activity of the heart through an EEG, and having a bone density scan as well. This is likely to give us a much better picture of where that person is with their physical health than sticking them on the weighing scales. And we know anyway that body mass index is not a great indicator either. At different heights and different what's the word I'm looking for?
Stature frame.
Frames, thank you. Different frames, that it's not very reliable at all. Okay, so this is the sorts of things we want to be looking for, therefore. We want to be thinking about those electrolyte imbalances, dehydration, blood pressure, that can be a difficulty in these experiences, body temperature, so the basal body temperature can be low. The activity of the heart, super important to check that out. Bone density, as I mentioned, and again, this idea that weight isn't the best measure, and also checking out the dental health regularly. A lot of people that struggle with disordered eating also struggle with their dental health, whether that's because the calcium is too low and therefore the teeth aren't forming well, whether it's because there's self-induced vomiting and the acid is eroding the teeth. So we also want to be supporting people to have that checked out too. And then we have muscle dysmorphia, and this is really interesting because muscle dysmorphia used to sit under the umbrella of eating disorders back in the day, and then it migrated and now it sits under the umbrella of body dysmorphic disorders. So it used to be a subtype of an eating disorder, now it's a subtype of body dysmorphic disorder, which I think says a lot about the two diagnoses, because kind of the clinical position is they're separate, they're different. Well, okay, how is it then that we're getting subtypes migrating, and how is it that so often they overlap and intersect? So muscle dysmorphia used to be called reverse anorexia, strangely enough, because the person, rather than thinking they're too large, has a sense that they're too small. And used to be classified as an eating disorder, and it can be really difficult for that person to know that they're struggling with or to seek help, let's say psychologically and emotionally, because of this sense that actually I'm being healthy. It's healthy to have a low-fat diet, it's healthy to eat lots of protein, it's healthy to spend lots of time in the gym. And it's all about level of impact, isn't it? So if you're going to the gym and you're doing your low protein diet and you're enjoying life and you're feeling good about yourself, that's one thing. But if it's beginning to take over your life and it's beginning to cause distress and impairment in daily living, then we're talking about something else actually. And particularly when we're thinking about disordered eating, the distress that these things can cause. So, restrictive eating, use of protein powders, use of dietary supplements. We've also got anabolic steroids in there, not necessarily an eating disorder behaviour, but it's an ingestion of something with an attempt to change the body that's actually detrimental to the physical health. And I've definitely heard people say, in fact, I was lucky enough to be giving a talk in the House of Commons with one of the members of Parliament who recently talked about his experience of muscle dysmorphia, and he was saying, I think he broke his ankle or something similarly worrying, but it didn't stop him going to the gym and spending hours in the gym. And this is when he began to think to himself, maybe the fact that people are telling me this is worrying, perhaps they're right, maybe this is too much, maybe I'm going too far. And that also comes with physical risks, and it actually has one of the highest suicide rates, muscle dysmorphia. So it isn't just a little bit of a gym thing, it's a serious experience that needs to be taken seriously. And then in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition 5, it has this as part of the criteria for BDD. So there's all different aspects of the criteria for BDD, aspects around insight, aspects, as you heard this morning, around hours spent in front of the mirror, aspects about the level of impairment of the activities of daily living, and this is another one. So the appearance preoccupation is not better explained by concerns with body fat or weight in individuals that meet the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder, and that includes that otherwise specified aspect. So what this means is that if a person is presenting with the focus of attention being on the overall weight of the body and the overall number on the scale going down, they're more likely to get a diagnosis of an eating disorder than body dysmorphic disorder. And the reason this is important is not so much about the label that we give it, because again, I do believe all these things are very fluid, but important in terms then of how it's treated, how it's talked about, what kind of pathway that person gets put on clinically. And sometimes people aren't asked those curious why questions. So it might be that they're losing a lot of body weight, and it might be that, you know, when the clinician asks about their diet, that they're severely restricting their diet, and therefore they are given one of those eating disorder diagnoses. But if asked why they were doing that, there might be something unearthed more around what you might say is a body dysmorphic disorder tendency, because it's on a specific defect. So, and Catherine Phillips gave a talk in the very first BDD Foundation conference, I think it was 2014, was it? Something like that, 15, 16. And she showed this graph around the most common areas of concern. And so, you know, the skin is one, the nose is one, and weight was something like 5 or 6. So again, we're saying they're separate, but we're saying that weight can be one of the perceived defects. And often within the diagnosis of BDD, or the person is more likely to get a diagnosis of BDD than an eating disorder if it is focused on a particular body part. So with the expressed intention to alter a specific body part. So if my perceived appearance defect is my face, and I've told myself, and I believe, and I'm hanging on to the hope of, if I lose weight, it will change the shape of my face and the contours of my face, then I may restrict my diet, and I may even engage in things like purging. But I'm not interested on the number on the scales going down. I'm not interested perhaps in the calories so much. I'm interested in changing the shape of my face. And unless someone asks me why I'm restricting my diet or why I'm purging, they're not going to find that out. As another example, clearing the skin is a big one. So focus on the skin is massive within this diagnosis. And if I believe that my skin is very blemished, and maybe I do have some acne, and this is important to note as well, because it used to be in the diagnostic criteria, if a person had any expression of acne, then it wasn't seen as BDD. But actually people can have acne and BDD because it's the level of distress that it's causing. If I believe that my face is covered in blemishes, I may do certain things with my diet in order to clean my skin. I may have read online, you know, that drinking lots of water, eating lots of salad, not eating sugar, not eating this, not eating that is going to make my skin better. And therefore that's the reason I'm engaging in particular dietary practices. The hair is another really common one as well. So perhaps I'm engaging in certain dietary practices to thicken my hair or to stop it from falling out. And again, unless I ask questions why, I won't find out. I've also come across people who will avoid certain foods for fear that they'll stain the teeth. And those people, I can think of 2, initially received a diagnosis of orthorexia, you know, this clean eating, because they would only eat certain colours of food. And but actually, it wasn't so much about the desire to eat cleanly, it was more about the desire to prevent the teeth from being stained. And dysmorphia, if you like, is a characteristic of many of the eating disorders, but not all of them. So what I mean by that is that this kind of view of the body that's different from the view that others have of the body, whether that be of weight or skin or hair or whatever the perceived defect is a characteristic of anorexia, often is often a characteristic of bulimia. but not necessarily so. And again, we need to ask those curious questions. Where it is an underlying part of it, we also want to be questioning body dysmorphic disorder as well, because it's not so much about the safety behaviour, it's about the reason why. And we could think about disordered eating as one of many safety behaviours. You know, if my focus of attention is my ears, one of my safety behaviours might be wearing a hat to cover the ears up and searching online for surgery to pin them back. If the focus of my attention is the shape of my face, it might be restricting my diet. It's sort of same canvas, different paint, if you like. Okay, so we've said that there is some overlap already in terms of a person might engage in disordered eating behaviours with the specific intent to alter a body part. And there's also some other commonalities between disordered eating and body dysmorphic disorder. And as I said a little bit this morning, I'm using the language that's used because it is the language that we can all talk about quite easily, but I do think it's helpful to think about this not so much as a disorder, but an attempt at order, an attempt to try and fix something in order to feel better about the self and take control of one's life. So another commonality is this aspect of poor interoceptive awareness. So studies have unequivocally shown with anorexia and bulimia, and I imagine it's existent across other eating disorders, we just don't have the studies yet. And also there's been studies into body dysmorphic disorder. The interoceptive awareness is poorer than in the general population. So interoceptive awareness, as you know, is the lived experience of our body from the inside. It's how we're able to feel those internal signals. So it's things like our hunger and fullness signals, our body temperature, blood pressure, pain, the heartbeat. And in fact, the heartbeat was the thing used to measure it for body dysmorphic disorder in a recent study. All of those things are interoceptive signals, and studies have shown that it's poorer in people with these diagnoses. Of course, it's a chicken and an egg situation. Does the poorer interoceptive awareness precede it and lead to it? Is it fueled by it? I imagine probably a mixture of both. But the interesting thing is why this is important. So it's important from the aspect of our physiological health, because it's quite handy actually if I know when I'm hungry and I'm full, because if I don't, that can also feed into disordered eating behaviours. But also, and same with skin picking, same with hair pulling, but also it's really interesting in terms of the emotional life. So Anthony Damasio talks a lot about how emotions use the body as their theatre. I think that's a lovely way of putting it. So our emotions express themselves through the interoceptive signals of our body. You know I'm a bit nervous right now, although you're all smiling at me so kindly because my heart rate's a bit faster. I've rolled my sleeves up, which I rarely do because I'm feeling a bit hotter. I have a sense that my interoceptive signals are alerting me to something. It's handy to know that I'm anxious early on, because then I can recognise it and I can do something to modulate it and regulate it. If my interoceptive awareness is poor, I may miss those signals actually. I'll miss the signal of my fluttering heart and feeling a bit hot. And then I won't notice it until it's reached a crescendo. And people will often talk about this feeling like they're either feeling numb, so they're feeling nothing actually. And I hear things like, I feel like a wooden person, I feel empty inside, I feel like there's a glass wall between myself and the rest of the world in one moment. And then suddenly feeling like just totally overwhelmed by emotion and totally unable to cope with that, and very little in between. And that's this linked with the nervous system, which we'll talk a bit more about, and also, I mean, the two are interlinked anyway, linked with poor interoceptive awareness. So increasing our interoceptive awareness, I would argue, for both eating disorders and BDD would be quite helpful actually. And we'll talk more at the end about how we might do that. So in addition to being characterised by poor interoceptive awareness, both BDD and eating disorders are characterised by nervous system dysregulation. And again, I mentioned that briefly this morning, but again, it's this idea that So we have those two branches of our nervous system, the energy mobilising and then the energy conserving. In the middle we have this window of tolerance, and it's this idea that we're kind of swinging between the two. So we're swinging between this feeling of overwhelm and this feeling of numbness. And because both of those experiences are very difficult to tolerate, we need to engage in a behaviour to bring ourselves back into the window of tolerance. And disordered eating, unfortunately, works well in the beginning. It works well in bringing us down or bringing us up. And because it works well in terms of soothing us, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, it can become compelling because it worked last time, so why won't it work this time? So it becomes my coping mechanism, it becomes my safety behaviour. So I would argue that it's helpful, it's helpful to think about safety behaviours as soothing seeking as opposed to destruction seeking. We're not actually seeking to destroy ourselves. It might look like that to the outside eye. We're seeking to soothe ourselves in some way. And actually this can spiral into becoming self-destructive, but it doesn't start that way. Is this all making a little bit of sense so far? Okay, that's delightful. The time is flying. So very briefly then, this window of tolerance model. So this is the idea of that energy mobilised, sympathetically driven state and that parasympathetically driven state and that window of tolerance in the middle. But also what's important about this is the way we tend to deal with things that overwhelm us. So this model is often used for trauma. And if we think about trauma as any experience where we are emotionally overwhelmed and unable to escape or fight back in any way, then we begin to appreciate that probably we've all experienced some level of trauma in our lives. And if we're feeling emotionally overwhelmed for whatever reason, the first thing we do as human beings is that we try to socially engage, and that makes total sense, doesn't it? So we try to bring people close to us and we try to have an experience of connection to soothe ourselves. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, or it isn't available to us, or perhaps we've tried to do that in the past and we haven't quite managed it for whatever reason, we'll go into the second line of defence. So this is an energy mobilised state. It's that sympathetic fight, flight, freeze or fawn. And this is sort of above our window of tolerance. So the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. We get a rush of adrenaline, and it's at this point that we might be seeking some of those behaviours. So we know, for example, that starving the body can bring these feelings down, actually, can kind of soothe that sympathetic arousal. So if that doesn't work, perhaps we can't run away or flight. And actually, if we think about fight, flight, freeze and fawn, eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorder are particularly a flight behaviour. They're particularly a flight behaviour because we are escaping from something that feels unbearable. Often the thing we're escaping from is our felt sense of our own badness, and then we're escaping into the mirror, into the disordered eating behaviour, into the mirror checking, into the seeking cosmetic surgery to somehow cope with that, to both give ourselves the sense that we can fix that sense of badness, but also to regulate the nervous system. And if that doesn't work, we go into the third line of defence, which is parasympathetically driven, driven by the dorsal vagal nerve. So if you want to look that up, it's a fascinating nerve. And this is where we get that numbing of emotion and numbing of sensation and numbing of feeling. Binging brings us here, actually. So if somebody is up here and they're experiencing that feeling of flight, and then they go to eat a large quantity of food, that has this effect, this kind of numbing effect, which can be quite handy in the short term if you're feeling that the thing that you're coping with, whether that be the emotion or an external experience, is unbearable. But in the long term, it doesn't work, because afterwards comes a feeling of shame, guilt, and then so the cycle may possibly continue. I also just want to say, because I think it's really important, that all of the behaviours we might engage in, whether they be with disordered eating behaviours, starvation, binging, purging, or other kind of safety behaviours that are more commonly related to body dysmorphic disorder in the literature, we're doing the best that we can. We really are doing the best that we can. We're doing the best that we can at the time with the resources that we have. So I know that these experiences can often come with a feeling of shame, but actually, you know, we're trying to do something to modulate and regulate ourselves. Okay, so as I said, safety behaviours, including disordered eating, are in part self-regulation strategy. The difficulty is with the lost my train of thought. What is the difficulty? The difficulty is that the nervous system will habituate to these behaviours. So in the example of, what example can I use? In the example of starving, it might be that when I have this rush of unbearable emotion that's probably fueled by a felt sense of badness within myself, and I feel that sense of anxiety, and then I perhaps skip lunch in order to bring myself down, in order to give myself the message, oh, I'm doing something to fix this, that might work in the short term. So I might momentarily feel a bit soothed and feel a bit more in control of things. And maybe that works for a couple of weeks. But then what happens is my nervous system and my digestive system will habituate to that. So now, 2 weeks later, skipping lunch isn't enough, because it isn't enough to kind of quell those feelings. So now I need to skip lunch and dinner. And that's enough for a few weeks, and you can see how it happens. Similarly with mirror gazing, you know, maybe I look into the mirror for 5 minutes and I check my skin, and in that moment it's enough just to bring my anxiety down a little bit, but my nervous system habituates, and then the next week I need to spend 10 minutes, and then, you know, half a year later I'm spending 4 hours. And I think it's really helpful to think about how that can happen, and therefore again that it isn't something we should be ashamed of or feel is our fault in some way. It's our nervous system doing what our nervous system does, and if we can support it, perhaps we don't need to continue in that cycle. And actually often once we engage in the safety behaviours, we feel exhausted, absolutely exhausted. So we've done the binge and the purge, or, you know, we've picked the skin in front of the mirror for a long stretch of time, and then afterwards it's like there's no energy left in the body, and that's because we've gone from that hyper-aroused state and dropped down into that numb hypo-aroused state, which is kind of what we were trying to do subconsciously in the first place, in a funny kind of a way. So we've got the two branches of the nervous system, as we've just described. We've also got the two hemispheres of the brain. It's fascinating that the body kind of has these seemingly opposing aspects that seem to be working in a sense against each other, although they're not really. So when emotion becomes unbearable, we tend to come into and inhabit more the left side of the brain. So the right side of our brain is like the emotional side, and interestingly, in the context of eating disorders and BDD, it's also the part of the brain that holds the schema of our body. So it knows kind of the whole picture of our body and where different sensations occur. That's the right side of the brain. And then we've got the left side that's a bit more logical and linear. It likes to make everything into an equation. And if we're struggling with our emotional experience, it may be too painful to inhabit that right side of the brain, so we may come more into the left side. What this means is that everything becomes an equation, and that everything that doesn't fit that equation gets thrown out. So, and this is where BDD and eating disorders can feel so illogical to the onlooker. And there's often incredulity because, you know, you're an intelligent person. Surely you can see that having another cosmetic surgery isn't going to solve this. Or you're an intelligent person. Surely you can see that starving yourself is dangerous. But the left brain will just throw that out, because the left brain has come up with a certain equation like, if I lose X amount of weight, I will feel better about myself, my shame will be reduced, and I'll be able to have a better life. I'll be a better person, I'll be a more lovable person. So this is the difficulty with this kind of coming into the left side of the brain. And then we've got the corpus callosum in the middle that offers information between the two. And if information isn't going between the two, those kind of emotionally driven experiences, so when we engage in the binge and the purge, or we engage in the starvation behaviour, the left side of the brain won't necessarily cling to that emotionally. It will throw it out again. It doesn't tend to cling to emotional affect. So rather it might explain itself by saying, well, I needed to do that because if I didn't do that, I'm going to put on loads of weight, and then I will be even more unlovable, and then feel even more bad about myself. So, yes. kind of said that. So let's just briefly think before we move on, and we will leave a bit of time for discussion as well, because I'm sure you have your own thoughts about this. In terms of the brain as well, in terms of what's happening, so we've got that amygdala, that part of the brain that's like the smoke detector part of the brain. And if we feel that we're under threat, and that threat might be from our own emotional experience, then that amygdala will rapidly fire. It will initiate the hypothalamus to release adrenaline, and it's that adrenaline rush that we might perhaps be seeking, actually, particularly if we're feeling numb. But interestingly, what adrenaline does is it focuses our attention, narrows it down, and that's what we get in the experience of BDD as well. Everything gets focused down. Similarly with eating disorders, everything gets focused down into something very narrow. That in part is that adrenaline system. The heart will speed up, the respiration will speed up, and then, so that's our sympathetic branch, our energy mobilising branch, and then cortisol will come in, and that will stimulate the parasympathetic branch, which is where we get the drop. So what we find is, with both eating disorders and body dysmorphic disorder, we are totally stuck in these highs and these lows without experiencing very much in between. And because that's so difficult, it can be difficult then to come out of the behaviours because they're almost fuelling. It's almost as though the nervous system has been therefore set up to dysregulate under stress. So I'm feeling a difficult emotion, I don't know what to do with it. My nervous system doesn't know what to do with it because it hasn't learnt to regulate itself. And so I need to go to the safety behaviour. I need to go to the binge, I need to go to the purge, I need to go to counting my calories. And as I said before, so we can conceptualise these experiences as a flight response. So, I guess this is the interesting bit, isn't it? Okay, so we know that our nervous system works antagonistically, and we know that in eating disorders and BDD it can be dysregulated. We know that people with diagnosis of disordered eating and BDD have poor interoceptive awareness, and we know that they tend to come more into the left hemisphere of their brain. Okay. What now do we do about it? So I've just got some ideas here. There'll be many, many others, and they're abundant in the literature as well. So if we think about the brain in particular, part of what we want to be doing is activating the connection between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. We also want to be doing things that gently bring us back into an experience of our more emotive side of the brain. So art is a big one, anything artistic and creative. Singing is a particularly interesting one. So I work as an educational psychologist in my day job, and I've met children that cannot speak and that can sing. And I thought, And then I went into the research and I found actually it's because they're different parts of the brain. So it's the left hemisphere that's more the language, typically, depending on which hand we are, but won't go into all that. And then on the right-hand side of the brain is the music side, the musicality part of ourselves. So singing beautifully does both. So whatever that looks like for you, that can be very powerful. Also curiosity, that sounds very simplistic, but curiosity switches on the right side of the brain. So as soon as we become curious about our experience, we're into another aspect. So, and it's difficult to do, and I'm not underestimating how difficult, but in that moment when we are opening the fridge to have that binge, becoming curious about, I wonder why I'm doing this now. You know, am I in the house on my own? Am I feeling certain sensations in my body? What sensations might I be feeling in my body that have led me now to this? And along with that is questioning those automatic behaviours, the things that we keep going back to again and again, and being curious about why those cycles are occurring. The self-compassion that we mentioned this morning is very much a right-hand side part of the brain, but brings the two together. Anything that crosses the midline of the body, the right arm and leg are operated by the left side and vice versa. So if we're using both arms and legs and we're crossing the midline of the body, we're going to be bringing those parts of the brain. And you might think, well, that sounds very simple, but it's amazing the impact of something like yoga and Tai Chi on a sense of kind of integratedness. and then also verbally sharing our emotional experiences. I'm going to whip through some of these so we have time for a little bit of time for discussion. How do we increase interoceptive awareness? There are many ways. These are my personal favourites. So any kind of mindful movement with the breath, yoga again comes up. Particular meditations that ask us to connect with the felt sensations of the body. So the body scan you might have come across. There's also a meditation called the tracking of needs meditation, where you think about, well, you don't think about it, that's my left brain. You feel the you feel the sensations in the body. Then you consider what needs those sensations might be pointing to, and then you consider what actions you can take to meet those needs. And it's like a little cycle you can repeat to yourself. It's very beautiful. The listening and responding to your interoceptive signals. Verbalising where sensations felt in the body, and that could be on your own, in your bedroom. You know, inhaling and lifting up one arm and then verbalising. As I do that, I can feel the muscles in the right side of my ribs extending, and feeling the heartbeat. And this is the one that came up in the BDD study, that people with a diagnosis of BDD aren't very good at detecting their own heartbeat. And remember, this is a measure of our ability to connect to our emotional state. So, you know, putting the hands on the heart, maybe doing 10 seconds of quick jogging, and then feeling, okay, there it is, and connecting with that felt sense of your own heartbeat. We need to update our amygdala as well. The difficulty with that smoke alarm part of the brain is that it isn't very good at updating itself. It's actually not only stuck in millennia gone by, but also stuck in our own personal past experience. So checking reality out, which is easier said than done. Something that I find very helpful personally, and have found very helpful in my own life, is placing my hand on my heart and asking that terrified part of myself how old it thinks I am. The answer I always get is about 6. It thinks I'm about 6 years old. I'm not. I'm 36 years old. So I lengthen through my spine and I remind that part of myself I'm 36 years old. And it's almost like updating that frightened part of yourself that perhaps might be stuck in an experience that was very painful. Lengthening through the spine when you're afraid, to show that you've actually grown, you're not so small anymore, because a lot of these experiences will be rooted in earlier experiences. So it's almost like we're continuing to carry out a response that was started ages ago, we no longer need, but the amygdala doesn't know that, amygdala. Repeating phrases like I am safe. I particularly like to do it like this. So as I press each finger into the thumb, I am safe, I am safe, I am safe, I am safe. That's got me out of some very sticky situations, and it can be just in the mind under the table. And bringing them attention back to the present moment awareness. So, you know, when it's all spiralling and then there's that desire to go to that safety behaviour. Okay, I'm Nicole Schnackenberg, I'm standing in this room, the carpet is green, I can see the leaves, perhaps there's something I can hear, maybe there's something I can smell, bringing myself to this moment and letting the amygdala know you're not back there when I was being bullied, or you're not back there when I was feeling ashamed, you're here now, and actually here's safe, here you're okay. And then increasing our window of tolerance. The good news about the window of tolerance is you can make it wider. So what that means is that if I have an emotional experience that spikes me up in terms of my sympathetic nervous system, because my window of tolerance is bigger, I spike up, but I don't go outside of my window of tolerance. I can tolerate it. And that's very, very useful. So part of that is staying with those difficult emotions. Again, easier said than done. Actively taking ourselves outside of the window of tolerance. So for some people, it can even be very challenging just to sit with nothing in the hands, doing nothing alone. And it might bring up all of these difficult emotions, but allowing them to come up and just staying there with the breath and allowing it to play itself out. And in that way, you're broadening your window of tolerance and also updating your nervous system. Breathe into that emotion, welcome it. Hello, fear. There you are again, coming up a lot today. What do you want to tell me? What's your story? Why are you popping up right now? And if we externalise it and talk to it like that, it's quite interesting sometimes, the answers it can give. Something I've mentioned before in other places is that you can write perhaps the fear with your right hand, which is the left side of your brain, and then answer with your left hand, which is the right side of your brain. So involve the right side of your brain and get the left hand to let you know actually why it's fearful and what it needs in order not to feel fearful. And then painting that emotion, sculpting it, and also recognising that the fear is an experience you have. It's not who you are. So it's not you. And that sounds really simplistic, but actually I think a lot of us really identify with our emotions because they feel so overwhelming at times. But actually it's something that comes and goes in our experience. And again, yoga and similar practices. So I want to finish there just with these last points. So remembering that BDD and disordered eating can and often do overlap. And it's okay for us to challenge clinicians if they're saying to us, well, you've got a diagnosis of anorexia, so you can't have BDD. Well, actually, maybe I do. And therefore, maybe I need 2 different kinds of treatment. Treatment for eating disorders should include both psychosocial care and nutritional input. Early intervention, as Amita said, cannot be overemphasised. Important, really important, to have the physical health checked regardless of the weight of the person. It's not enough for that person to stand on the weighing scale. We need to check out their electrolyte imbalances. We need to check out the activity of their heart in particular. Not being afraid to talk to someone if we feel that they are struggling. Again, that can be difficult to have those conversations, bless you. But if we're opening it, not so much with, I've noticed you've lost weight, which might cause that person to react quite defensively, but rather, I'm a bit worried about you, you seem quite sad, is there something you'd like to talk about? Can often be a smoother opener, let's say. The importance of addressing those underlying feelings of not good enoughness and shame, and considering the nervous system related factors, considering that actually the reason I continue to starve myself is because it numbs me out to difficult emotions, and therefore if I begin to eat more in inverted commas normally, I may feel those emotions and I don't know what to do with them. Okay, then I need to be supported to know what to do with those emotions, otherwise I'm not going to feel able to come out of that behaviour. And it's absolutely possible, completely 100% possible, to move beyond both disordered eating and body dysmorphic disorder and go on to live a happy and fulfilling life. And I've personally had both of those diagnoses and struggled a lot with them, and I think I'm one of the happiest people I know. So it is absolutely not beyond the realms of possibility. So I'll leave you with some resources, and I'm sorry, is it until 2 or 10 past 2, Hannah?
Until 2, so I've got 6 minutes for questions.
Oh good, that's fast, is it, that clock?
Yeah, 6 minutes.
Oh,
exactly.
Okay, lovely, that's good. So any comments, questions, reflections, ideas? Yeah.
That was such a good talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Where do you think hypnotherapy comes in?
Hypnotherapy.
In all this situation, because I deal with binge disorders.
Yeah.
And now there is a new protocol, not NHS protocol, just in the private sector. They're trying to introduce hypnotherapy with these patients.
Yeah.
Do you think it will help from your experience?
Yeah, I think, of course, it will depend on the angle that's taken. I can speak from my personal experience if that's in any way interesting.
Sure.
So my poor parents tried all sorts of things with me, and one of them was hypnotherapy. And I remember one of the things in hypnotherapy was this idea of supporting me to have more compassion with myself. And one of them was to say to myself just before I fall asleep at night, "Good night, Nicole." And I remember at the time thinking, this is all a bit hippy-dippy. but now, all these years later, so more than 20 years later, I do not fall asleep at night without hearing my own voice say to myself, "Good night, Nicole." So I would never discount any of these therapies, and there are possibilities with all of them. And I think where hypnotherapy can perhaps be particularly helpfully used is with increasing interoceptive awareness. So, with the body scan and bringing that person into the felt sense of their body. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure quite what I want to say other than just thank you, because I think what you shared today has been just so mind-opening to me as someone that's suffered with an eating disorder for a long time. And then what I found what's left for me is the BDD.
Yeah.
And particularly about what you were talking about this morning, and I was going to ask you a question about this kind of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system in this kind of window of tolerance.
Yeah.
And actually the link perhaps for me in that in relation to like chronic fatigue, this kind of like really heightened sense of being, and then this absolute, and then also then going into the safety behaviours, and then what's followed for that is this kind of chronic fatigue after that. And I think, I mean, I've just been frantically writing notes because I think when I was first diagnosed with an eating disorder, BDD hadn't been recognised. It was, you know, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just been, just a comment really to say thank you, because it's just opened, it's just kind of put, there's a physiological kind of neurological kind of thing going on that I didn't realise was going on for me, and it's explained so much just to me on a personal level about what's going on with my nervous system.
I'm glad. I'm really glad to hear that.
How that becomes habitual, and of course it's going to progress and get worse.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you for this morning as well. I just thank you.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that, and I appreciate you. Thank you. And thank you. Thank you very much. And I think you bring up two really, really important points there. One about the time lag between, moving beyond an eating disorder and then the body image struggles. It's still there. And I read a study recently that the average time, and how they found this out, I don't know, and maybe it's longer or shorter, of course, for different people, hence why it's an average, I guess, but is a year's time lag. But actually, my experience of speaking to people and my own lived experiences, because there's sometimes this idea of, we just restore your body weight in the case of anorexia. You're going to have this light bulb moment, you're going to stand in front of the mirror, you're going to see yourself as you really are, and you'll be like, oh, okay, and then skip off into the sunset. That would be lovely, but it doesn't happen that way. There is a time lag, and it takes time to grow into a different sense of your body, whether that's an eating disorder, whether that's body dysmorphic disorder, whether you're coming to terms with the fact that this perceived defect is there and you're not going to do anything about it and come to an acceptance and possibly even a love of it, and that is possible. Or with an eating disorder that you're going to deal with a body that's a different shape and size to what it was before. And I think we've got to be realistic about that, but hold on to hope that it can change. It just takes time. And then the other aspect I've already forgotten, but you said something really interesting there about the nervous system and how we habituate, and I think also that's really important to acknowledge that can also take time. And we also know from the research that people with a diagnosed eating disorder are more parasympathetically driven. That's so interesting, isn't it? And that's my lived experience as well. Probably one of the reasons why I'm coming across fairly calm right now, possibly, but I'm not, I'm actually quite nervous, is because I'm more parasympathetically dominated. So I'm more like this anyway. So I've probably just pepped myself up into my window of tolerance, and I'm not up here, which is where I would be if I had a more balanced nervous system. And I think if we understand our own nervous systems and understand that to be the case, and think, okay, maybe I'm exhausted because my parasympathetic nervous system is in overdrive because of some of the experiences I've had and the way my nervous system has learnt to regulate itself, then we can remove the stigma and then do something about it. Okay, now what can I do to, and something I've been really interested in doing is working on a list of things that stimulate the parasympathetic and a list of things that stimulate the sympathetic. So I know when I'm feeling on the floor, totally numb, the fire alarm could go off and I would just sit here and think, oh, goodbye, have a nice time, everyone, I'm just going to sit here. How do I get my sympathetic nervous system going? And there's things that I can do to do that, and that's very empowering, because at that point I know that my nervous system isn't in control of me as such. I have some control over my own nervous system.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Nicole. That was brilliant. Shall we say thanks again?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.